So everybody wonders, what is Joe Biden going to do in regards to Iran? Is he going to be lifting the sanctions? Is he going to be getting back into the Iran nuclear deal? This weekend, Joe Biden actually sat and faced the nation. He sat on Face the Nation, and he was asked this question of whether or not he would be lifting the sanctions against Iran. This is what he had to say.
Will the U.S. lift sanctions first in order to get Iran back to the negotiating table?
No.
They have to stop enriching uranium first.
Okay, so he gives off a little head nod and the world kind of goes wild. And so here is what the White House ended up coming back to say about that. They said that his head nod didn't signify shift on Iran. Goes on to say right here that President Biden's position that Iran must come back into compliance with the nuclear deal before the United States returns to its unchanged. Is unchanged. The White House said Monday after the president appeared to suggest a shift in an interview over the weekend with a head nod. Says overall his position remains exactly what it has been, which is that if Iran comes into full compliance with its obligations under the GCPOA, the United States would do the same. And so, okay. So they say, so if they come into compliance, meaning if they stop enriching uranium at the high levels that they're enriching, because right now they're doing it a little higher than, normal, than what's agreed to in the Iran nuclear deal, that if they go back into compliance, then the United States will do the same. But then it says, and then use that as a platform to build a larger and stronger agreement that also addresses other areas of concern. So they're saying that the Iranians need to get back into compliance on their own accord before the United States will entertain getting back into the Iran nuclear deal. But then she ups the ante and says, and then we would use that as a base in order to negotiate some other areas of concern. So this is why the Iranians are saying, you go first. This is exactly what's going on, because right now we're at a stalemate with Iran. The Iranians are saying, we're not going to stop what we're doing until you guys come back into the agreement and drop the sanctions. When you drop the sanctions, then we'll know you're good for it. And then what we'll do is we'll stop and we'll go back to the agreement levels of uranium enrichment. The Biden administration is saying, no, you go first. So it's a draw, and they're both pointing at each other and say, you go first. No, you go first. Now, the Iranians, under principle, are correct. It was the United States that dropped out of the deal. So it would be the United States that needs to come back into compliance before Iran would come back into compliance. I understand their point completely. Plus, the Iranians think that they're going to come back into compliance. And then the Biden administration will say, OK, good. Now, maybe we'll drop a sanction, but we're not going to drop all of them because we're going to use this as a negotiation starting point to do a bigger, better deal, one that we want, one that's better for us. And the Iranians are saying, we're not going to do anything until you come back into full compliance and drop all of the sanctions against us. We are not coming back in and taking the bait. So this is a draw between the two countries right now. And this is ultimately hurting the Iranians. I mean, look, part of me thinks if I were Iran, I would do it. I would say, all right, fine. We're going to show how crappy you guys are, and we're going to call your bluff. And if I were them, I would say, okay, fine, we're going to get right back into compliance. We're going to do everything exactly the way we're supposed to, and we'll see what you do. And if you guys don't drop all the sanctions, then you look like the monsters. You look like the bad guys. And then the world knows it's you, not us. So if I were Iran, I would actually go back. I would do it. I know right now they're saying they're not going to do it. Right now they're saying there's no way. It's the United States' fault. They're right. I get it. They are right. But at the same time, they're the ones who are suffering the most, and they have an opportunity to show that it's the United States that's being the aggressor on this and not them, even though that was always the case all along. I mean, the fact is that they were complying with the deal. The United States decided to drop it anyway at the behest of Israel, most likely. And, so I understand Iran's situation. However, I want to show you this. This is the effects. This is from BBC News, six charts that show how hard U.S. sanctions have hit Iran. So this is the problem. The sanctions against Iran are not hurting the United States, but the sanctions against Iran are hurting Iran. And this is really devastating. In fact, look at this one right here. Here's a chart showing the economic growth in Iran. So this right here is before the nuclear deal was implemented. So you could see that they had some, then there were some international sanctions imposed right here. And then, look at what happened to their economy. It tanked. I mean, it just tanked. And it kind of went up a little, then down. And then there was the nuclear deal here in the blue. The nuclear deal implemented, lifted the sanctions. Look at how well their economy bounced back. Their economy is doing well. And then look at what happened. The U.S. reinstates the sanctions, and look what happens to their economy. It goes right back down. So this is obviously really, really hurting them. That's their GDP growth rate. We've got down here. Here's their oil exports. Look at this. So this was where they were at the beginning. Then U.S. sanctions Iran's oil industry. The EU bans their imports down here. And then it tanks. And look at them. They just were tanking all down here. And then the sanctions were lifted following the nuclear deal. Everything was going up. And then look, boom, put more sanctions on them and make them tank. When looking at these charts, I think it's really clear why the United States why Trump decided to get out of the Iran nuclear deal. I think it's clear. And it's that Iran started to prosper. And that was too much of a threat to Israel in the Middle East. And so they decided that they had to cut them down at the knees in order to stop their growth, in order to stop their expansion. I think that is really clear when you look at these charts. Here's another chart here. This is the Iran Brent crude exports in millions of barrels per day. See how it was doing just fine. And then when the U.S. gets out of the deal, boom, pummels them. It's terrible. So this is their currency. Their currency has hit record lows recently. So this is where they were. And then the United States gets into the deal. It goes up a bit. And then the U.S. goes out of the deal and it starts to go down. Luckily, it hasn't gone down as much as it has in the past, but it is on a downward trajectory. Who knows how deep it will fall? So these are also their living costs. Their living costs have gone way up. So this is the problem is people in Iran live off of what's equivalent to $100 a month. People are living off of $100 a month in Iran. It is really bad. And, this is where they were in their how much things cost. And then the sanctions, and suddenly when we get out of the Iran nuclear deal, their cost of living goes way up. So just wanted to show you guys how this is really, truly hurting the Iranians. And these charts, by the way, were before COVID. This was from 2019, these charts. So now with COVID, Iran has really been suffering with these sanctions. It's been actually a crime in a lot of ways to continue the sanctions on them during a global pandemic, during a time when we saw how hard they were hit. The media was showing that Iran had mass graves and they were burying all these bodies. Iran, by the way, when it comes to actual deaths per million, they're not, they were in the top 10 at the very beginning of the pandemic. They've now dropped down somewhere in the, I think, 60s. They're not that high. I mean, it's bad, but it's not as bad as most of the other countries, in fact. So but they've still suffered. And I think with the sanctions, it's just been so much worse on them. But, look, the Biden administration is saying we're not going to do anything until Iran makes the move first. The Iranians are saying we're not doing anything until the U.S. makes the first move. All of this, because of the stalemate, what it does is it leads to a potential aggression. So a potential for further aggression, because if Iran says, we're not going to go until you go, we're not moving until you move, and Iran continues to enrich uranium at the levels that they are right now, that will just create anxiety and more cause for Israel and the United States to potentially go after Iran in tougher ways. And that would be a disaster. We definitely don't want that to happen. So, just keeping you updated on that. And I will, of course, keep you updated further because we all know how quickly things can escalate when it comes to foreign policy and especially when it comes to Iran and wars and, our need to stay in the Middle East because we got to keep Iran in check. That's really what this is. So I'll keep you posted.